So, and whether a certain amount of distrust in media might even help building stable societies or overcome these fragile contexts. And this panel is hosted by the Leipzig-based Research Center on Development Communication, as well as MICT. And we will have 2 input speeches first, and then we will open it up for the discussion with you and your questions. And we will start with our first 2 speakers and the first presentation. And our speakers are Dr. Anja Wollenberg, who is head of research at MICT. I don't think that I need to present you in more detail again. And she is accompanied with Anke Fiedler, who is a research associate with MICT, but also a project leader in different EU-funded projects, including REPAST, which was hosted at the University of Munich and has been involved in InfoCore, which was another EU-funded project on media and reconciliation in post-conflict countries. So please go ahead. We are looking forward to your input.
Okay, this panel is on issues with trust in fragile context. And Anke and me are going to start by describing how the political context in fragile states is having an impact on media structures, and how these media structures, in our view, from our experiences and observations, is having or is influencing media perception and trust in media. And then Hazrat will go on and pick up this topic and talk about Afghanistan. And our presentation will be based on evidence, as Carola just mentioned, from Iraq and Libya and Sudan and DRC. So it's a bit of a cross-border observation. And we focus on commonalities actually between those countries in regard to media perception. Now, what is a fragile state to get started? According to Ulrich Schneckener, which is a German scholar in this field, the most salient feature of a fragile state is actually its struggle with non-state armed groups, such as militias or insurgents or guerrilla movements, and the armed violence or armed conflict that comes with that struggle. So the state is no longer able to protect its citizens against this violence, and the state monopoly on violence is actually undermined. So with this comes societal cohesion being under pressure, and in all the countries that we look at, societies are mostly all fragmented and polarized alongside the fault lines of conflict. And what is more, another defining feature of fragile statehood is that the rule of law is fully or partly absent, and that public services are in decay, and that public institutions are actually weak, which often resides in that the governments and the ruling elites are questioned altogether. Their legitimacy is very often, or in most of the countries that we look at, under question. Now, so this is a fragile state index by Fund for Peace. You can see that fragile statehood kind of accumulates in Central Africa and parts of the Middle East. Now, and we, according to our observation, that's the hypothesis that we put forward here, is that media structures in fragile states, according to our observation, carry specific features that come with fragile statehood, namely, first and foremost, a high level of media instrumentalization, a high level of media capture. So the media ecosystems that we look at are mostly all entirely undermined by political parties and parties to the conflict that use media, instrumentalized media in pursuit of their goals. Those goals are mostly connected to or are related to increase of power or even takeover of power. And accordingly, the coverage tends to be partisan and biased. And the mainstream media landscape mostly is fragmented and polarized alongside the fault lines of conflicts, as is the society. So in most of the countries that we look at, we can actually connect almost every media outlet to one of the parties that is owning, operating, financing, or supporting in one way or the other these media outlets. just finished together with Carola research in Libya, which included the media mapping. And we found, for instance, just to give you an example, that 19 out of 20 TV stations could be very clearly connected to either one of the two main conflict camps, which is Khalifa Haftar in Benghazi, the east of Libya, and the Sarraj government in Tripoli. And we could see that if you looked into ownership structures, financing, and political affiliations of executive personnel, we could see that you see on the very left, right column from you that where the money comes from, and then in the middle column where the political agenda is to be was outlined by our analysts. So it's a very clear picture, and so this is, you know, party media capture in fragile states, an example. Now in Iraq we see a similar picture. Now another key feature that we found is that there's, in those countries that we look at, there's really no scarcity of information whatsoever. We look at really high numbers of media outlets available to the citizens, and it's partly due to the weakness of public institutions that include weak or absent media regulation. For instance, in the media mapping in Libya, we found 214 media outlets serving only a population that was less than 7 million people. And in Congo, DRC, we found 600, or there is 627 radio stations up and running. So that's, and even in Sudan, only 1 year after the revolution, there's 33 TV stations up and running, most of them private. So we kind of look at a high number, if not an abundance or even oversupply of information in those countries. Now, the hypothesis that Anke and me are putting up here for discussion is that what we found in the studies that Anke is presenting in a minute, or the evidence, we found that actually media environments in fragile states, as they were just outlined by me, kind of promote media critical attitudes among the audiences. And our data, or according to our analysis, this media critical or media criticism is clearly geared towards partisanship and partisan coverage and media capture. This is clearly disliked by the people and a cause of criticism and distrust. And Anke will share some insight from the evidence that we have on that. So if this observation can be further substantiated, this would also mean that people can less easily be manipulated than we commonly think, in my view. I think that media power is mitigated and constrained by this kind of distrust, and that this distrust in some way protects the people against undue manipulation by partisan media. That's something that we are all concerned about. So from that point of view, distrust could be also seen as like a vantage point for media literacy. That's where media literacy could get started in the sense of critical reflection and critical questioning what is presented to the people by the news and the media. So Anke, you want to take over from here?
Yeah, our thesis draws on findings from various strands of research. You can see it. Research on media perception, especially qualitative studies. And as you can see on the slide, we rely primarily on data from focus group discussions. The guiding question for all studies was, you can see it on the bottom, was how do lay publics perceive, use, and assess media in fragile contexts? Due to time constraints, I will not discuss each of these studies in detail, You can see the most important information on the slide, but I will turn directly to our results. We have identified 3 strong trends in media use, perception and evaluation across the selected fragile states. The first trend we want to highlight is an overwhelmingly high level of awareness regarding party media affiliations across countries and across differences on age, education, and gender amongst participants in focus group discussions. These media users are not only very savvy about who owns which channel, but they are also very critical about it. Here you can see 4 slides from our studies that or from the studies that I'm going to read out. Libya, in my view, all Libyan media is biased. When you sit in front of the TV, you get depressed. There is no credibility and no transparency around events that happen in Libya. Another quote from Sudan, national media does not care or cover atrocities in Darfur. Tens of people could die today and you will not hear about it in the national TV. Then a quote from Iraq, news get published to either support certain faction or to bring certain people down. And the last quote comes from the DRC, policymakers prevent the population from being well informed. They want the media to report in favor of their political line. The second trend is related to the first one. In the face of media instrumentalization and media capture, people start refining their truth-seeking practices. Instead of trusting one source, they tend to combine the use of different sources from different backgrounds, mainly for the purpose of scrutiny. For instance, one of the interviewees, a 53-year-old housewife from Goma, said that she listened to the UN-funded radio station Radio Okapi, Digital Congo, that was said to be close to the then President Kabila and his family, and the international broadcaster TV5 Monde, and the government-run TV station RTNC. The next quote is from Sudan again. When I read any news on social media, I usually assume that 50% of what I read is true. I look for more sources like officials and newspapers' accounts before I consider a news item credible. And this brings us to the last trend. All studies strongly indicate that there is a low level of trust in partisan media. Of course, some of the study participants complained about lies and false information or news bias, but most of them expressed a rather general feeling of mistrust in media, as show the following quotes from the studies. From Libya, we have other sources as well, and so if the news is not compatible and consistent, then of course we don't trust it. Iraq, I don't trust media that are fixed to one side. And the last quote from the DRC, some radios hide the truth from us. These radios destabilize the country because this sort of misinformation is intended to help one side or the other, and that creates unease, the root cause of many conflicts. To conclude, our findings indicate that media environments in fragile states produce a strongly critical and media-savvy audience, an audience that is skeptical about the truthfulness of what is presented to them by the local media. And this is contradicting common assumptions about audience attitudes implied in academic discourse on the role of media in conflict environments and media policy concepts. Simply put, not media content is the message, but media structures. And the view angle that we take in this presentation also frames distrust in media as something that connects to media literacy, as Carola said at the beginning. Media literacy, media skepticism, and critical reflection. And framed as such, distrust appears as a healthy attitude that protects media users against media manipulation and undue influence. I will stop here. Of course, we are happy to hear your comments and questions later, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation, Anke and Anya. Please keep your questions in mind or note them down, because before we start going into the Q&A session, we would like to ask our third speaker here, Hazrat Bahar, to say a few more words about the situation of media usage and perception in Afghanistan. And Hazrat is a lecturer at the Sheikh Zayed University in the Khost province of Afghanistan, or he was, one must also say, and is at the same time a PhD candidate at Shanghai University. And he's currently based here in Germany, and he will give us some insights on what he found out with regard to social media in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I will briefly shed some lights about media in Afghanistan. I have not conducted particular research about the trust in Afghanistan. As it was mentioned, my expertise or interest is more about in social media, but generally, I will just touch upon some issues about Afghanistan and media in Afghanistan, and before the region change and after the region. I just titled that presentation, Media Trust in Fragile State, the Case of Afghanistan. So first is broadly speaking about the media landscape of Afghanistan. First is the ownership in Afghanistan. There are basically two types of media ownership in Afghanistan. One is the first owned by the state, and the other is private media. There isn't any public media in Afghanistan, which I think was most important, particularly in the previous government, although there were some attempts that could lead to bring public media, but that did not materialize. So the second one is about media outlets. There are around 450, there were actually more than 400 media outlets in Afghanistan. And that includes TV, radio, newspaper, and also online news agencies. We did not count the news websites, but just websites of those, for example, like Tulu or some other prominent media in Afghanistan. We just counted like TV. So the third issues about the media landscape of Afghanistan is the freedom of media Afghanistan used to have. But when we are talking about here, it's about the previous regime, not after the collapse of the government. Afghanistan was relatively exercising more free media comparing to the old region in Afghanistan. That includes Pakistan, India, China, Central Asian countries, and Iran. So it was like 122nd, it was ranked out of 180 countries by Reporter Without Border in 2020 or 2021. And it was ranked 118th in 2020. And 118 in 2018, respectively. So it was when we were comparing that ranking with the neighboring countries, Afghanistan was having a more free media, where media could easily or openly criticize the government. They could openly criticize anyone else in Afghanistan. And it also had, I would say, one of the liberal law of access to information. It was ranked first, I think, in the world. Ironically, that the ranking was done by a Canadian organization. But these were all about in the previous government. But now, the ownership remained the same. There we have two types of media, state own media and private media. And media outlets are, I would say, shutting down. Within this previous 2 months, more than 150 media outlets were closed. A different reason, funding reason, and also the freedom of media is, I would say, is shrinking. And there was some like risk for journalists who were working there, particularly for the women journalists and media outlet run by women. And freedom of media, so far there isn't, because that's just happening now, like after the regime change, like not more than 3 months. So there isn't any ranking, but like obviously there will be, I think, more limitation and constraint imposed by the new regime. Later on, media reception and perception. I was thinking that it might be because of the very traditional structure of the Afghan community, but yeah, there is also, that happen in other more developed countries too. Like the most, the reliable source of information for people in Afghanistan are, you would see in the very right, that's friends and family members. And also more than like 80% people are receiving information through their family member and their friends. Also radio is, I would say, the second, TV is the third. In TV's availability is also matter, but it's very, I would say, accessible and available in a urban area, but in a rural area, it's also a problem because of the electricity and also the infrastructure and also the economic situation in the country. So the perception about media, I would say media is still one of the leading tools for obtaining news in Afghan communities. It was also, its impacts were also visible according to the survey conducted by the Asia Foundation. It says, like they survey people's perception about women, and they concluded that those who are receiving information from TV, this seems to be more moderate or open-minded when they were talking about the freedom of women. So it means media impacts were more, I would say, visible, and the impacts actually the very concept, the concept of or mindset of the people. However, people were also more, I would say, suspicious about whether they should, when they were looking into the medias. Basically, there may be many reasons, but to my understanding, it's like most of the media in Afghanistan after the 9/11, when the Afghanistan was, the Taliban regime was toppled, and the international community pumped a lot of generous funding, particularly into media. And they also brought a media, I would say, that was not quite suitable to the Afghan community, because still Afghanistan seems to be a more conservative society, but the media system, the structure, were more liberal. So there was some kind of like fishy thinking about the people's, like they were considering media more like a foreign agent, where they were like instilling idea which they thought were not more Afghan, or maybe more like a foreigner. And because that was hugely funded by the international community, mainly the United States. And they were also, I mean, it's like the media, when you're talking about the media, that means the community media and also the mainstream media that was more like a countrywide media in Afghanistan. And because that media was hugely paid because of broadcasting political ads provided by the international security forces in the country, and also provided by the government itself, which was more like, I would say, anti or opponent, or more pro-government and pro-international society. So the second thing might be why people were more suspicious about the media was more like maybe because of the lack of professionalism in Afghanistan. Still, I would say we can say that lots of media is run by not very professional people, and media is still considered to be like a business rather than like media, where they could educate, where they could like watchdog the government. And third one we can say is countering the dominant narrative in Afghanistan. Is more, as I said, it's a more like a traditional society. So when you're criticizing the very dominant values in the country, so you may be labeled with different, you will be marked with the different labels like a foreign agent or funded by, you're promoting like values that are not so suitable in the society. So these might be the possible reasons, just concluded, and there might be so many other reasons too. I did a particular online questionnaire for this presentation, and it was online. So it was more like, I would say it was filled by the netizens, those who were using social media. So it may not be like it's difficult to generalize. So it's more particularly about the people who are using social media, because we spread the questionnaires online on Facebook and on Twitter and some other social media. We asked some broad questions. I will not go deep into the concept of trust and the methodology, but it was broadly summarizing. We simply ask people whether how they obtain information and whether they trust those information, and if there is any change in terms of trusting media before the regime, in the previous government and after the regime change. So the result was, I would say, in sharp contrast, because yeah, in terms of the obtaining information, because in a countrywide survey, lots of people were receiving information through their friends and family, but here it says like 97% of the people, of the people receive information through me. They trust information that was received through media, that's like TV and radio, and they do trust. Almost 97% people say that they trust. It's very, I would say, ironic that why the degree was so high. It says like 10% people say they always trust the media, and 50% say usually, and 33% they say occasionally. But this about the obtaining information. About when it comes to the trust in media, 73% people say they trust. Only 4% out of this 73, they say they strongly trust, and 35 they just trust, and 38 somehow, or yeah, they trust. And the type of information, the more trustworthy type of media channel was, of course, TV, and then news websites, and then radio. So here the family and friends are very, I would say, in a very narrow. Only 10% people say they trust information that are received through their family and friends. About the media trust, whether their trust was affected, if there was like a deficit in their trust before in the previous government, in the recent government, 59% people say yes, their trust decreased, and after the regime change, and 31% say it's the same. They don't see any change in terms of their trust, and 9% people say their trust have been increased. And when we ask about the reason, like why, and most of the most widely answer was the Taliban's are censoring media, and the other one like media are not independent, and the other ones, the funding matters, and also lack of professionalism. So the last part, it's I name it media in transition, because in the previous government, the media structure, the practice was different compared to the now what is now there in Afghanistan. Because of the political system changed. Before, Afghanistan used to have a, let's say, more a democratic political system, but now we don't know about the structure, but it's like emirate, which seems more like a kind of, I would say, dictatorship. There is no elections and they're just choosing among themselves. And in terms of freedom of media, a recent report that was compiled by, produced by Human Rights Watch, it says freedom of media is shrinking in Afghanistan, and they were citing so many reasons, and they also quoted from kind of like regulation that was shared with media produced by the Taliban, citing that they should not report unless the report has been confirmed by the Taliban, and they should not report issues that could damage the reputation of the Taliban, and also the issues that could insult the religion. As I before mentioned, that media outlets in Afghanistan are closing down, and more than 153 media so far have been closed, but mostly those that were run by women. And recently, as it was mentioned here too, that most of the journalists who used to work in Afghanistan, particularly Afghan journalists, they are fleeing, and this because of the risk that they see in doing their job in Afghanistan. So once the journalists are fleeing the country, there's more chance of like, there may be so many incident events that may go unnoticed because of the lack of having journalists in Afghanistan. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hazrat, for these insights into what has happened very recently in Afghanistan. And we notice definitely that it is a fragile context here in particular. We have like 30 more minutes for discussion, and I would like to invite everyone again to raise questions and comments. My first question would go to the panelists here, because I thought the thesis that you had, this hypothesis, or the claims that you made from your observations in the first presentation, I mean, they indicated that people obviously, in particular in these fragile contexts where there is a cacophony of voices, that people actually know how to navigate between the information and the different interpretations they get. And I mean, we are sitting here in Germany, and we also heard in the opening speeches this morning that there are these observations in Germany that one says, well, since social media came up and since we have such a cacophony of voices, we have a problem, obviously, with trust in the media, with people trusting in institutions. But obviously, in these fragile contexts that you just explained, people know how to navigate. They know much better who to trust and maybe whom to not trust. So is this just a kind of a very Western concern that we have with regard to this cacophony of voices, and that trust can be actually established through, media literacy in these different regions in a much better way than through regulation or these kind of things?
Okay. I mean, that's part of the hypothesis that we brought up, no? That this is the idea, or this was actually the starting point for our discussion, that we observed that with the change in media structures and all of a sudden the challenges that come with liberation, that media literacy and skills and capacity to deal with the media grow immediately because of the challenge. And this was something quite striking throughout all my work. I have this experience. People are super critical, they're knowledgeable throughout across borders about ownership issues more than we are, for certain. I mean, in Iraq, you can ask anybody in the street, they will just simply know which TV channel and what radio station is owned by whom. And so, and that has to do with the political change and the way media developed. So it's an iterative relationship, or it's an and so I would actually say yes, it does grow with the media structures in a positive way. And I mean, from a Western point of view or media assistance point of view, we have this tendency to assume that not only quality of journalism is low, but also media literacy is low. And I was wanting to question that, actually.
Maybe I have two. Is it on? Yeah. I fully agree with what Anja said. Maybe I can just make a small additional note on that. Being able to navigate through this, you called it cacophony, does of course not equal or not be equalized to being secure or feeling secure. So it is rather a media use pattern, if you want. So the way you use media, that you try to compare, that you compare different sources, rather than feeling a feeling of security. So this is actually what it is all about. People trying to compare, to find truth, or at least to gain security, to know what is going on, actually. So and maybe this is also the big difference when it comes to our context. I mean, there's also this cacophony, but you can still search for truth in the social media, but you have at least one, if you want, hegemonic truth that is still the legacy media. So there are two different spheres, whereas in those contexts, you don't know what the truth actually is right now, the truth, whatever it might be.
Interesting. I have already two questions here from the audience, one from below, from behind. Yes, no one. Oh, it's Christoph Smokes. You need to open microphone number. Which one is it? Now it should work. Doesn't work yet? No. No, otherwise the online audience can't hear you, but I think there is another one coming, right? Is there another one? Here we go.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Christoph Spurk. I'm from the Institute of Applied Media Studies in Zurich. I have a question to Anja and Anke. I understand that this information and the statements come from focus group discussions. So my first question would be, how sure are you, or you have any more detailed information from surveys, how widespread that critical attitude, or this knowing how to navigate the news, how widespread is that? Is it 5%? Is it 50? Is it close to 98? So I think this is important because I felt that your statements are very interesting, but I think your conclusions are too straight, too fast, too straightforward. I see that you say people cannot be manipulated. That goes for me too much out of the data you have. I think even if people don't trust, we know this from this environment and from other environments, they still read the news or they still use the media. And constant using the media, it may slow down the process of manipulation, but does it really protect it? Does it really prevent it? So I think this would be interesting information in addition, how many people do that and what do the people do that trust the media? We see in many African countries, half of the population still trust the public broadcasters, although they are just mouthpieces of their governments.
Thank you. You want to go ahead?
Christoph, I would 100% agree with what you're saying. That's why the sentence I used was like, there might not be as easily to be manipulated as we commonly think. So this was like the relative, this is how I put this, or it's a hypothesis, actually. You know? It's an observation that we found interesting to share. It's more a starting point for more research, I would say. Also what we did, there's the number of studies, some of them not even conducted by us. No? We're looking cross country into data that were partly also gathered by other organizations, just to substantiate that first observation, to see if there's something to it. And but what we actually did, at least in the focus group discussions that we conducted, we did separate low and high level education participants from one another in the groups, as well as gender and different regions as well. So there's a little bit, and the most striking observation from these focus groups was that across gender, across education, across countries, we had those observations that indicate a generally high level. I mean, that's a hypothesis that we have, that this is a crossing differences. Yeah.
I would like to add that I believe this is the strength of qualitative research. I mean, I don't have these numbers that you were asking for. I don't have them. But I believe this is the strength of qualitative research, because we have been talking since this morning about how do we measure trust? How do we operationalize trust? And I think this is the strength of this research, actually. And as Anja said, I mean, we try to vary the independent variables to achieve more or less theoretical saturation, so that we have people from different segments of the population in terms of age, gender, education, and so on, so that we try to find out if there are patterns that bring all these people together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question over here. Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Friederike von Franke. I am from the Institute of Democracy, Media and Cultural Exchange. Thank you for this great presentation. It's just cool to have a different angle on partisan media. And as you said, it helps criticality in media literacy in a way. So the ownership is be questioned and skepticism is higher. So people are getting more a wider information sources, more other strategies of getting information, as you said. But what about the dedicated polarized audiences of, let's say, special and even biased media? Let's say this is my media, and although I know, or I maybe deny that these media are spreading lies, I am loyal to this whatever mouthpiece of this partisan group, and I still have trust, and I even follow their call to whatever, the capital of the United States or other things. So that was my question to you. And my question to you would be, in terms of fragility, would you say that the regime change in Afghanistan supports fragility of the media system or stability of the media system? And what do you expect in change of audience trust? Thank you.
Okay. Shall we start with you, Hazrat? Maybe with the last? Yeah, please take. Just.
Yeah. I would say about the future of the trust in media in terms of the audience, whether their trust will increase or whether that will decrease, is more like we need the trust is also like, no, it's not like a single issue. So it's kind of like a multi-dimensional issue that is affected by, I would say, the media system, the political system of the government, and also the freedom of media. When we see these indicators, the region change. Of course, previously it was a democratic government, and where media could have more freedom. As I said, it was ranked highest among the regional countries, but the region changed now. So definitely, I think it will also affect the freedom of the media, because lots of journalists are these days, they have been threatened, and they have already left. And as I say, that the Human Rights Watch reported that media freedom is shrinking in Afghanistan. So I think the future may be more, the suspicions or the skepticism may be increasing. People may not be, I think, trusting in media, because when we look at the Taliban, when they first came into power before 2001, they had only one media, that was a radio, which was highly censored and highly monitored. They did not allow to free media. But these days, although the regime change took place very recently, although I would say there are more still free media in Afghanistan, but medias are closing, media outlets are closing, and freedom is shrinking. So I just think that the trust may be also negatively impacted. Mm-hmm.
To the first question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question, important question. I would not necessarily equate media use and media trust. So you spoke about loyalty. So especially in those contexts, people turn to specific media outlets, not necessarily because they are loyal to this media, because they trust it or believe in it, but because they get information from it that is important for their daily life, and also to get along in this difficult situation of conflict, to gain security. And I mean, especially when you think of the research that we conducted in the east of Congo and in the years 2015, 2016, there were so many rebel groups that were really committing terrible crimes towards the local population, but still people, they would listen to their voices, they would listen to their, I don't know, posts online, or also to their media channels if they have, but not because they believe in it, but because they get information from there that is important for them to know how this group that is approaching my village or whatever might treat me or us, our community. So so I would differentiate here between, yes, I said media use and the way I turn to media motivation and media trust.
Okay, thank you. Before we continue, I have you on my list. We also ask the online audience what they would like to hear from our panelists.
There's some questions here from the online audience, and I'm combining some questions here to Hazrat mainly. And one is, before the Taliban came in, how was the funding affecting trust? I mean, the funding of media, local media or national media, affecting the trust of the audience. And the second question here is, now as the Taliban are in the government, how can these media actors, especially local radio, can continue their work in this also financial difficult situation? And the last question, I'm reading this to you. Do you have a sense of how trust in different media sources works among the Afghan diaspora now, particularly in Central Asia?
Okay, the first questions, like how the funding was affecting the media trust in Afghanistan, I think I have mentioned before too that it was because since most of the media was funded by international community, where they also had particular demands or kind of conditions that you should, okay, I am funding you, but you should broadcast this. And I would say they were imposing some conditions which were not actually more suitable in the society. So that I think made people more suspicious in terms of trust. Like they were saying, okay, that media is like receiving fund from country X, definitely they will be also accepting or imposing some kind of values or conditions, as I said, that may not be so suitable to that society. Beside that, those media were also running more political ads, which were definitely against means like they were so extreme in a way that they were supporting the international community. Those political ads were like supporting the international community's presence in the country, and also their military presence in the country, and also they were supporting or promoting or propagating the government stance about particular issues. And meanwhile, they were also opposing the armed opponents, and they were like more notoriously preaching against those armed opponents. I think that also somehow negatively affected the trust, because people were thinking that the media is not so independent, or it's not more like impartial, it's more like subject to the funding. And the second question was, yeah, I think, yeah, it's not only the media, it's the whole system is very badly impacted by the withdrawal or the collapse of or the handover of the regime. But right now, unless the international community intervene, I think most of the media will collapse as well. But if the international community is nowadays intervening in terms of funding them, better they should consider the points that had negatively impacted the previous community radios. For example, they could fund a radio without imposing some of the values that could be contradicted into that society, that may be challenging the dominant values, or that could go against the principle of journalism. And the third question was about, yeah, the sense of media trust, I think, among the diaspora. Yeah, I don't have exact information, but generally speaking, TV is also ranked, always ranked the first in terms of trust. More people are trusting TV compared to other media outlets, if it is among the local people, or if it's among the diaspora. I think the same may applies to Afghan diasporas, particularly in Central Asia or anywhere in the world.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 more questions on my list. Are there any more questions? Okay, 3 more questions then. 4. Okay, then maybe we collect 2. First, Sophie, Janusz.
Hello, I'm Sophie Janusz. I'm the coordinator of the FOME network and also working for Cameco in Aachen. I think Carola Richter made this attempt to compare the situation in these fragile countries with the German situation, our assumptions. What I understand, Anke and Anja, is that one important factor is that these societies are highly politicized, that there is a strong urge of the population to find orientation. But yet, and I think that was also what Friederike meant, you give the impression, as we do have all these different parties, and then we have a separated population. And from the outside, this population is checking what they are doing and finding their way. So I really think that that question stays, you have to decide finally for a side or for a decision. You have to take a decision. What is true? To what truth do I react? And it would be nice to hear something about that. And then I have a question to you, Basrat. I noticed in the research done about the main sources of trustworthy information. In the overall study, I read like 70–80% of persons said it's family and friends I trust and my main source of information, while when you ask the netizens, that percentage was around 10%. So I mean, how do you interpret that? Is it a special group? Is it young against older populations? A change in the attitude? Does it have to do with education, access, language?
Thank you. Please prepare your answers. We take another question just behind you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Roya Zaitoni from Ruhr University in Bochum, and actually my question goes into the same direction, because I would assume that people trust more media that have or that display political attitudes that correspond to their own political attitudes, or distrust media that has or reflects political attitudes that contradict their own political attitudes. So do you have any information about like the political or even social or overall attitudes of the people that you were having in your focus groups?
Okay, so please try to answer briefly.
I mean, from what we could see from the qualitative research and the focus group discussions, was that partisanship was disliked across, no matter which party. This is simply like an I would say an across border and country finding. And this was so clear across all the focus group discussions that we had, no matter what party. It was like generally disliked and rejected as a way of journalism. My question that I have then since some time is, why do all the media keep on going? As I say, why don't they wake up? This is a question I have. I mean, obviously, no one believes them. Obviously, this is disliked across the board. But they keep on doing the same journalistic practice in the same way. I don't get it, really. I think there should be some kind of circulation about the findings that we have about trust, and use that for media development or of some kind. But that would be my answer. And to Sophie, also, I think not only that the societies are more politicized, it's also that if you look at the situations that the people find themselves in these like armed violence, tumultuous transitions, they also depend a lot more on information than we usually do. I mean, we had the same experience now with the Corona crisis, that we all of a sudden dependency on information was increasing big time for us as well. So, and then you could tell it was really important to, it was really important to compare and arrive to a picture that is has not only one channel as a source, but is a patchwork of information, has used a patchwork of information sources. I would say, I mean, this dependency on information is a very strong factor that drives this kind of different practice that is geared towards comparison and verification.
Okay, and shortly, Hazra.
Yeah, I think the reception of information through different channels, the countrywide survey says like more than 80% people are receiving information through our friends and family members, while the netizens are mostly dominantly receiving information through other channels. So the percentage were very limited, I think like more around 10%. I think first of all, I think the most important indicator maybe the educations, because in Afghanistan only around 40% peoples could read and write, while the peoples I surveyed on that online questionnaires, almost all of them were educated in having a bachelor degree and also master degree too. And that, I think that's the most dominant factor. Secondly, I think it's also the affordability in access to information, access to the media channels in a country like Afghanistan, where they may not be able to afford having TV. I would say, of course, they could afford having a radio, but when it comes to TV or the electricity is not widely available in Afghanistan. So I think access to media may be the second factor that could explain the stark differences in terms of receiving information among the educated or online community or offline community.
Okay, so we're having the last round of 2 questions. Yeah, first, and then Ines. And I would like to announce also that we asked Benjamin Tom for a very short response from his position to what the audience, what the panelists here presented. So please go ahead.
Hello, this is Sid Nazir Afridi from Pakistan. I'm running Tribal News Network close to the Afghan border. I have 2 quick questions for Hazrat Bahar. And one question is about, like you are saying, media houses are shutting down, journalists are fleeing from the country. So how do you see the role of international media like DW? They have specialized service in Pashto and Dari, and the same is like Voice of America, and they have a huge following in Afghanistan. And the part of this question is, and how do you see the role of social media, since Taliban are like also using social media very effectively? So how do you see its future in Afghanistan? My second question is about the shutting down of some of the media houses, whether they are shutting down their media houses due to the Taliban pressure or their policies, or there is like a non-arrival of funds from outside, from media development organization or donors.
Okay, and then the last question, Ines.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting contributions. I just wanted to raise an issue, which is, do we also have a blind spot somewhere when we think of sources of information? We could see in Hazrat's presentation that many people rely on family and friends. And we just at the university had a student presentation on journalism in Senegal, and there was an interview with a Senegalese young man who is a griot, like a descendant from a family of narrators and storytellers. And I was wondering, just a general question, if we sometimes also, if we are blind to also traditional communication systems when we look for sources of information in these studies, be they qualitative or quantitative.
Okay, so I would like to invite you for your last comments. Maybe we can start with Hazrat again to reply, and then one of you probably.
Yeah, the role of international media, if it's also highly relied on journalists in the ground. If they don't have journalists there, they will be also just covering issues based on information that could be with trustworthiness or credibility may be questions, but still people are highly following, because these are, I would say, the most trusted media, the international media, if it is VOA, if it is Deutsche Welle, or if it is BBC or anyone else. But most of their reporters nowadays, they have already fled the country, and I don't know if like how they will manage. And recently they say they are not going to hire new reporters because of the risk that they may be exposed to. But their informations are also, I would say, based on freelancer, unknown sources, or fixer, they call it. the journalist may not be known, but definitely they will be using some of their tactics to confirm the verification process. But most of those journalists have already left the country. And the second issue, like, was why they were shutting down the media houses, or why they are shutting down. Yeah, I think there are two reasons, as I mentioned before. First reason is, I think, the funding, because lots of international fundings have already stopped in Afghanistan. The second one is, I think, also the shrinking freedom for media, and also the greater risk that they are exposed to, because they cannot criticize the current government, although that issue have not been made public, but they have been told. I have journalist friends who say that, yeah, the new regime have already warned them that they could not report everything so freely like they were doing in the past. About the social media, I think that's the only option nowadays that could even challenge the more state narrative in Afghanistan. Also, the Taliban are so hugely using that social media, and they are, I would say, they were far better than the previous government. I conducted a small research about that issue. Like, the Taliban were more successful compared to the whole government, while they were like disseminating their information. I think they understand, the Taliban do understand the importance of social media, but I think they are also trying to somehow muzzle the online freedom and also the online public sphere, because they understand, because lots of people who are more critical against the Taliban, they are not living in Afghanistan, so they easily understand that they could somehow dominate and also somehow monopolize the online public sphere. So the Taliban are, I think, taking notes of all these online spheres as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And hopefully short answer.
I just answer Ines. My impression is we had strong discussions in family and friends is very, very strong, but that wasn't across countries, so we took it out as a main finding. But in Iraq, it's really big, and in Libya as well. And also religious authorities play a role. But I think not so much as information sources, but rather that's where opinion making takes place. My impression is that people talk a lot about media content, so what is reported, and then they discuss the way it's presented by the news, and then there's a lot of opinion making in this discussion, more than information sourcing.
Yeah, I understood your question in the sense that you wanted to know what storytelling plays in all this. And I mean, so I assume that you rather refer to techniques like sharing tales or histories. And honestly speaking, at least to my knowledge, this was not really taken in consideration in these studies, rather what Anya just said. So the role family, friends and families, peers play in making sense of information. So family and friends as a source of verification, of opinion making. So what Anya just said. So about this storytelling, I have to admit, I'm also not very familiar with it, how this would look like. But yeah, I think it's an important point, an important question.
Okay, thank you for these insightful answers here. And we have our very last contribution in this panel, and we kind of try to close the circle from the keynote speech about measuring trust and conceptualizing trust. And now that we've heard much about trust in fragile contexts, so maybe you can say a few words and comment on that from your side, Benjamin. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just say a few quick thoughts that I'll try to be brief, but that I was thinking about as I was listening to these presentations. One of them has to do with the importance of thinking about selective trust, or the kind of differentiation or discerning between different sources that I think came through very clearly in the first presentation, that in many cases when we care about trust in news, what we really care about is cultivating a sense of trust in sources of information that we think are deemed trustworthy. And in many cases, in many of these countries, that's not actually the case with many of the news sources that are available. And so trying to provide tools for people to do that kind of differentiation more effectively, or at least stuff what they're drawing on, to the degree that they're making distinctions between sources based on ownership or based on their sense of their journalism, or even their sense of the coverage of arts and entertainment that they find sort of resonates with them as these people get me or not. People are drawing a lot of different kinds of information, sometimes not accurate information as well. Sometimes a lot of rumors and misinformation about media. So thinking a little bit more in depth about the way that people go about that and the tools that people are using to sort through that information, I think is really important. The other, two pieces related to this. One is, I think there is a concern that as people are encountering more and more sources of information, particularly online, that the reaction often for people is to take a kind of general distrust approach and a sort of generalized skepticism of everything they're encountering. And I think that can be potentially just as dangerous as being overly trusting of everything you're encountering. And I think a lot of, particularly in places like the US and the UK, but I think in many places in the world, this is a growing concern that as people are encountering so much misinformation, or their sense is that they're encountering so much misinformation, that they're sort of taking it's a safer, more defensive place to be distrustful or skeptical of everything. And that can be, in some cases, just as dangerous. The other piece of this that I think I was thinking a lot about in the second presentation in particular was the context in fragile or unstable places where these questions around differentiating or being selective around trust take on growing importance. And so it makes a lot of sense that in these places, people might be more likely to engage in those kinds of practices because it's that much more essential that you do so in a place where the stakes are higher in terms of understanding and knowing whether to believe this information or not. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people have more tools. In many cases, they may have fewer tools available to do that kind of differentiating, do that kind of discerning between sources. And there are certain media literacy approaches or other kinds of initiatives that might be useful to helping people be able to do that. But I think that is one of the big challenges, is that people often feel like they don't necessarily have the tools available to make those distinctions. And so they often do then rely on their friends and family, or they rely on other trusted figures to kind of do that work for them so that they can have a better sense of which of these sources to trust. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, also for these thoughts. I think we have a lot of food for thought now. We also have real food here for you. And I would like to give a big hand to all our panelists here. Thank you so much. And we start over again in a little bit more than an hour at 2 o'clock then. You want an announcement? Okay.
Can I make an announcement regarding, so we have decided that since to the security situation, our safety concept, that we have only very few tables to stand on, but instead we organize these small tables. So what I encourage everyone to do now is to group those little tables and make like Lagerfeuer situation. What is Lagerfeuer? Bonfire. Bonfire. So that's the idea, and to somehow, improvise a little bit. I actually cannot really recall why we came up with the idea, but it's only, I think, 7 or 8 tables. So we do some kind of improvisation here, if you may help with this. Thank you so much.